We're starting a brand new podcast series for the month on boundaries and why boundaries are non-negotiable. Bruce Abbott, certified professional coach, founder of SecureHusband.com. Welcome back to the Secure Husband podcast. All month long, we're going to talk about boundaries. This is something that I know a lot of guys have tried. It's something you kind of have to fumble your way through. I have talked about this in previous podcasts. I had to go back and look. So episode 14, I started talking about boundaries, stop tolerating the intolerable. And then I just recently did another episode, number 143, and I'm going to dive a little deeper this month. I encourage you to go back and listen to those two episodes, episode 14 and 143, to see where we're at. Even though we did the groundwork on what boundaries are and what they're not, and why many guys misunderstand boundaries and why sometimes we get made to believe that boundaries somehow are mean, that boundaries are being unreasonable. I encourage you to go back, check out those episodes, especially the one with the dismissive-avoidant wife, because boundaries inside a marriage with a DA wife is going to be a little bit different if you are anxious-preoccupied or maybe you're fearful-avoidant who leans anxious. They're a little bit different animal. But let's give a little refresher here just to catch you up on why boundaries are critical for your self-respect and your sanity, why typical approaches with boundaries tend to fail, why they feel so damn terrifying for anxious men, and how boundaries actually create the only path to respect and attraction, especially with a dismissive-avoidant partner. So let's go back to the why. Because if you don't understand why boundaries matter, you're never going to hold them when it gets uncomfortable. And it will get uncomfortable. And I talked about boundaries with the nervous system, because if your nervous system is not regulated, you will have difficulty establishing boundaries. Remember, a boundary is not about control. It's not punishment. It's not manipulation. It's not an ultimatum. A boundary is simply what you will and you will not accept, what you will participate in a marriage. A boundary is not forcing her to change. It's about deciding and communicating what you will allow in your life. Again, that's where I talked about in the previous podcast, because a lot of guys get those wrong because they try to use boundaries to change their wife's behavior. That's not a boundary. That's control. And if there's one message that I hammer over and over since this podcast started, you are the only person you can control. You cannot fix your wife. A true boundary is going to be things like, babe, I will not continue this conversation if I'm spoken to with disrespect. If intimacy is consistently rejected, I will stop pursuing and redirect my energy into my own life. I mean, that for guys who are in dead bedrooms, that's a tough one. Babe, I'm not going to argue about this again tonight. We can revisit this tomorrow. Do you see something in that? You're not controlling her. You're just controlling your participation. That's a boundary. That is a little refresher from some of those previous podcasts. And a little refresher about that nervous system, because boundaries are life and death for anxious men, especially because if you're married to a dismissive-avoidant woman whose nervous system is wired for distance when yours is wired for connection, and you overfunction and you pursue and you try harder and explain and self-abandon in hopes of getting that connection. Again, it's not because she's a bad person. It's not because she is uncaring or cold. It's just because dismissive-avoidant individuals subconsciously lose respect for partners who overfunction and tolerate everything. When you have no boundaries, you signal low self-respect. That low self-respect kills attraction. It kills polarity. It kills emotional safety. Desire, it's not just her desire for you. It's your self-respect, your self-worth. It's how you feel about yourself. Eventually, you're going to start to resent yourself and resent your wife. Again, if you didn't get a chance to go back and check out that podcast in the last month here on boundaries with your nervous system. Because the thing about boundaries is it's not because you don't understand what they're about and you don't understand how to do them. It's just you're terrified of what will happen if you hold them, because you're afraid of the sexual shutdown. You're afraid of her maybe explosive temper, Or she gets cold and withdraws. Maybe she threatens divorce. Maybe she comes back and flips it around and says, you're just controlling. The deeper fear here is if I stop over-functioning, I might lose the marriage. That's why you keep tolerating what hurts you. You keep over-pursuing and overworking for those scraps of connection and affection, over-giving. Building upon what we talked about in previous podcasts, somewhere deep inside, there's that little boy, that inner child inside, who believes if I just try harder, I will finally be chosen. That's that abandonment wound. When you have a wife who is dismissive-avoidant, from her nervous system perspective, she's experiencing pressure and feeling smothered, feeling responsible for your happiness. Your energy becomes pursuit. Pursuit, again, feels like pressure to a DA. We talked about that. Leads to that withdrawal, that pulling away. The withdrawal then triggers your anxiety, and your anxiety then tries harder and pursues more, and then the cycle repeats. That's the anxious-avoidant trap. Talked about that over and over. The thing with all of this is you cannot resolve it through communication alone. It has to be resolved through self-respect and boundaries. So that's hopefully caught you up. What happens when there are no boundaries? When boundaries don't exist, you're going to tolerate criticism. You're going to tolerate a sexless marriage. You're going to tolerate breadcrumbs of affection. You're going to tolerate being treated like a roommate. You're going to tolerate a disrespectful tone and emotional distance and being a low priority. You keep showing up. You keep giving. You keep hoping. Eventually, something inside of you flips. And that's where the hopelessness kicks in. I talked about despair in a previous podcast. That's where the resentment builds. A lot of guys collapse into depression, they numb out. Alcohol, porn, work. Many times you hold it in, you bottle it in, and then after years of being passive, boom, you blow. You're top like a pressure cooker. And a lot of guys start thinking about, well, let me look outside the marriage. They start fantasizing about other women or start talking about affairs, and they feel justified. Because, well, if she doesn't want me, well, then fine, I'm going to go find someone who does. All of this comes back to one core issue. You abandoned yourself to keep the relationship, and without boundaries, that cycle never ends. So if boundaries are not about fixing her, what are they about? Well, they're about stabilizing you. When you begin holding boundaries, your nervous system calms. We talked about that. Your self-respect increases. And then what happens is you start to get clarity about the relationship. Your confidence grows. Your resentment starts to decrease because you're feeling more self-respect. You're having more self-compassion. Feelings of self-worth grow. You stop living in constant emotional reaction. It's that emotional reaction that keeps you stuck. That's why we did the nervous system podcast series, because our nervous system is driving the bus in all of this. Something very interesting happens, though, when you establish boundaries. Oftentimes, a dismissive-avoidant partner begins to feel safer, not less safe, when you have calm, consistent, two key words there, calm, consistent boundaries. Why? Because you're no longer emotionally flooding the relationship. Remember, that's vulnerability threat to your DA partner. We've talked about this all before. I'm just trying to kind of set the stage here for this next month, talking about boundaries if you didn't get a chance to go back. So when you're no longer emotionally dysregulated in the relationship, you're not trying to force connection. You're not trying to change your wife and over-pursue and over-explain and spin your wheels. That helps you become grounded, and that changes the dynamic. It's not going to happen overnight. It takes time, but you'll change the dynamic. So what boundaries look like in that dynamic is you stop the over-pursuit. You're not chasing anymore. You're not chasing for conversation if she's going to shut down. You're not going to beg for affection. You're not going to over-explain yourself and defend, and you're not going to do any of that. You're certainly not going to tolerate a disrespectful tone. You're going to stay out of these arguments that just keep going around and around and around. You're not going to sacrifice yourself anymore to keep peace. And so as you start to establish boundaries, you realize that you can regulate your own emotions and speak calmly and directly. And you're able to speak these things with clarity. Clarity so that the other person knows where you stand. And from there, when you're able to do this without any anger, you're not punishing, there's no ultimatum, This is self-leadership. The self-leadership starts to create change because from there, all of those things, integrity, self-respect, they come back in, and you start to build more of your own life around your relationship. You're now regulating your emotions. You're speaking directly. You're disengaging if conversations become disrespectful or unhealthy. And you stop trying to earn connection and carrying that whole load. This first podcast, again, is just kind of to bring you back up to speed. This is where we will build off of for the next month. We're going to go deeper into boundaries around sex in a sexless marriage. I want to talk about boundaries around criticism, boundaries around respect and tone, boundaries that rebuild self-respect, boundaries around emotional withdrawal. We're going to cover a lot of these areas. We're going to go deeper into this. Ultimately, the boundaries, again, are not about pushing your wife away. They're about stopping self-abandonment. When self-abandonment stops, that's where change happens. Your confidence builds, your energy changes, your presence changes. And whether your marriage heals or not, you become more grounded. You become stronger, more secure. We're going to build on that this month. I hope you get a lot out of this series, because if you've been living without setting boundaries for years, decades, maybe your entire marriage, this is going to feel very triggering and uncomfortable. But that's normal. You're not just changing your behavior, you're rewiring a lifetime of conditioning. No man is going to become secure without establishing boundaries. Boundaries are right there behind nervous system regulation. And no marriage is going to become healthy without boundaries. Boundaries are key to attraction, polarity. And so we're going to look at that all month long. And that will help you stay grounded and become more secure in your relationship. I hope this podcast is helpful for you. I hope you enjoy the series coming up. If you don't subscribe already, would you hit that subscribe button? If you're a regular listener and haven't given me a review, I would appreciate a review. There are men finding this podcast all over from all kinds of different places. The algorithm, if you give a review, that helps other men find this healing work. If you're trying to figure all of this out and you need some accountability, I encourage you, visit securehusband.com. There's a form on there for that free 30-minute consultation. It's just a no-pressure conversation to see if, hey, can one-on-one coaching help me? I'll see you on the next episode. Thanks for listening.